Good evening, friends. In tonight's story, we will step quietly into one of the darkest shadows of history, the era of witch hunts. A time when the lives of thousands of women were unraveled by whispers, superstition, and fear. They were midwives, healers, widows, and daughters. But they became suspects, prisoners, and flames in the wind. Before we begin, support my work by liking the video and subscribing if you enjoy it. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always makes me smile to see people from all over the world tuning in. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and relax. You're just about to drift off with a story. Before the accusations, before the trials, before the flames touched wood, there was simply a woman walking through her village, baking bread in a clay oven, washing linens in the stream, whispering stories to her children by candlelight. In the rural heart of 13th century Europe, life was deeply patterned by seasons, rituals, and silence. A woman's role was often fixed from birth. Daughter, then wife, then mother, then widow. Few choices, many tasks, and even fewer voices willing to listen when she spoke. Most women lived in small wooden homes with packed earth floors and smoke curling from a single hearth. Water came from a well, light from tallow candles. Soap was a luxury, comfort, rare. But in this world of hard work and quiet strength, women held knowledge. They knew which herbs eased childbirth pain, how to close a wound with thread boiled in vinegar, which roots to boil for fever. These skills were passed through whispers, not books. And it was here, in this knowledge, that danger would one day grow. In many villages, women served as midwives or herbalists. They knew how to coax life into the world and how to ease it gently out. They spoke with the sick. They touched the dying. They listened when others would not. And so people came to trust them, but also to fear them. Because when a harvest failed, or a child was stillborn, or a storm struck the roof, someone had to be blamed. And the woman who knew too much, who lived alone, who didn't go to church that week. She was easy to name. Still, this was a time before the true storms. Before witch hunts became law, before confessions were taken under fire and iron. In most places, the idea of witchcraft was still tangled with folklore, not fear. People whispered of old women in the woods, of charms and curses. But they were part of the world, not hunted for it. In Germany, the word hexex was barely used. In England, witch meant many things, sometimes bad, sometimes simply strange. And in the church, the official position was skepticism. Magic, after all, was a fantasy, not a crime. But this balance would not last. Something was changing beneath the soil. A shifting wind in the halls of power. A growing hunger for control, spiritual, social, and political. And at the center of it all stood the quiet, ordinary woman, still lighting her hearth, still humming old songs, unaware that soon even her kindness could be called a curse. Long before the flames, they were whispers. Soft ones passed between cloisters and cathedrals, of demons in the woods, of spirits that could turn milk sour, of women who danced too freely by moonlight. In the early Middle Ages, Christian Europe was still stitching together its beliefs. Pagan customs lingered in the countryside, the maypole, the midsummer bonfires, the blessing of fields. Old gods had faded, but their symbols remained. The horned creature of the forest, the healing woman with herbs tucked in her apron, and the church noticed. By the 10th century, official doctrines still denied the power of magic. St. Augustine had warned that only God had true power, and that what people called witchcraft was mere illusion, a trick of the mind or the devil. But as centuries passed, the attitude began to change. Local priests, especially in rural areas, began blaming the unexplainable on heretics and witches. A failed harvest? A strange illness? A child talking to shadows? It was easier to suspect the woman who lived just outside the village, who knew how to make tinctures from bark and moss. He didn't come to Mass. She kept a cat. She offered healing without the priest. At first, these suspicions were scattered. Small trials, local punishments. In Germany, a woman might be banished for using love potions. In France, someone might be flogged for dancing in the graveyard. These were not yet witch hunts. They were seeds, small, bitter, and growing. Then came the Black Death. From 1347 to 1351, the plague swept across Europe, killing millions. No one understood why. And in the face of mass death, people turned not to science, but to fear. They blamed the Jews, the lepers, and the women who walked alone. Many whispered that witches had poisoned wells, that the plague was not God's wrath, but a woman's curse. And so suspicion began to harden into belief. In the years that followed, demonology, the study of evil spirits, became more widespread. Books were written, sermons preached, and slowly the image of the witch began to sharpen. She was a woman who rejected the church. She practiced unnatural rites. She made a pact with the devil, sometimes sealed with a kiss upon his hideous form. It was no longer just folk magic. It was heresy. It was treason against heaven. By the 5400s, trials began to increase, not just for women who brewed herbs, but for those who were different, who argued, who mourned too loudly, who bore too many children, or none at all. And then, in 1486, came a book, not a gentle one, not a fair one, but a hammer. In the cold halls of a German monastery, a man dipped his quill into ink. His name was Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor. And in 1486, he would help write one of the most devastating books in European history, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It was not a gentle book. It did not question, it accused. They claimed that witches were not just real, but that they were almost always women, and that they were enemies of God, the church, and the natural world. Heinrich Kramer had already tried to prosecute women in Innsbruck. The bishop there had dismissed him, too cruel, too obsessed. So Kramer fought back the way many men of power did in that time. He wrote a book. With the help of another inquisitor, Jacob Sprenger, he framed witchcraft as a crime worse than murder. Witches, he said, could cause disease, death, infertility, storms. They seduced men, cursed livestock, made pacts with the devil, and worst of all, they did this in secret, with no witnesses, with no remorse. The book was written in Latin, scholarly, authoritative, filled with scripture and twisted logic, and it offered a clear instruction: how to find, try, and destroy witches. The Malleus gave its readers a blueprint, not just for identifying suspects, but for breaking them. It encouraged torture. It dismissed the need for real evidence. It even claimed that to disbelieve in witches was in itself heresy. For those who already feared women, already mistrusted midwives and widows, already resented the wise or outspoken, this book gave them permission. It was copied and distributed widely, not through printing presses at first, but by monks and scribes, passing it from cloister to cloister. By the early 16th century, it had been reprinted dozens of times. In universities, it became required reading. In courtrooms, it became the backbone of trials. A single book had helped change the course of law, of belief, of countless lives. And though not every judge or priest believed it fully, enough did. In the quiet rooms of Europe, its pages turned like whispers. And with every turn, a woman somewhere grew more vulnerable, because now the witch was no longer a shadow in a tale. She was everywhere, in kitchens, in gardens, in the pew beside you. All it took was one accusation, one glance, one dream, and the hammer would fall. Once the Malleus Maleficarum entered the world, it did not gather dust. It spread like smoke, quiet, choking, and hard to stop. Judges who had once required solid proof began accepting dreams as evidence. Midwives, who helped deliver babies, were now questioned for using herbs or muttering blessings. Healers who touched wounds with oils were accused of casting spells. The Malleus taught that a woman could become a witch through weakness, that her body was open to temptation, that her words were slippery, that her silence could be dangerous. And because of this logic, no defense was strong enough. If she denied being a witch, it was said that the devil had sealed her lips. If she cried, it was guilt. If she didn't, it was guilt. Across Germany, the first major waves of witch trials began. Towns like Würzburg, Bamberg, and Trier became infamous for their persecutions. In these places, entire families were wiped out. Children were questioned. Neighbors turned against one another. Parish records show entry after entry. Executed for sorcery, confessed under interrogation, property seized, and always the property was taken by and livestock, homes. Once accused, a woman didn't just lose her life. She lost her name, her memory, her dignity. The Malleus had given the system a script, but it was the people who followed it. In village after village, the pattern repeated. A cow died, a storm ruined the harvest, a child fell ill. And suddenly, someone remembered the old woman who always muttered to herself, or the widow whose husband died suddenly, or the herbalist who brewed teas that worked just a little too well. Sometimes these women confessed, not because they were guilty, but because the questions would not stop. They were asked the same things for hours. Sleep-deprived, beaten, found in painful positions. Some were shown instruments of torture, others were tortured directly, and in their pain they said what the court wanted to hear. I danced with the devil. I flew through the night. I bewitched the baker's wife. And then they were condemned, not just by the law, but by everyone who heard their name. The Malleus called for swift justice. But it was not justice. It was fear, cloaked in scripture. And beneath that cloak, too many women disappeared. What made someone a witch? Was it the way she walked? The herbs she kept in a pouch? A cat that followed her home? In the strange and trembling logic of witch hunters, almost anything could be seen as proof. And often, the most ordinary details were twisted into signs of sin. One of the first things they looked for was the witch's mark. A mole, a scar, a freckle in the wrong place. These marks were said to be devil's teats, places where the devil or his spirits could feed. If the mark didn't bleed when pricked with a needle, it was seen as proof. They pricked again and again. Women were left bleeding from shoulders, arms, backs, thighs, anywhere a spot or blemish could be found. Midwives were also suspect. They had too much knowledge of life and death. If a baby died in the night, it might be blamed on the woman who helped deliver it, especially if she used herbs, common ones like fennel, mugwort, or rue. These were once seen as helpful, sacred, even holy. But now they were dangerous, poisonous. Cats and dogs, once companions and pest keepers, became familiars, evil spirits in animal form. If a woman was seen speaking kindly to a stray cat, it could be reported. If she fed birds outside her window, it might be written down. Even the weather became evidence. A sudden frost? A dry well? A storm that struck only one field? The woman who lived alone was often blamed. She had spoken sharply the day before. She looked at someone too long. She had no husband to vouch for her, and so she became the cause. In many places, the very fact of being poor was suspicious. A beggar woman who knocked on a door and was refused might mutter as she left. If someone in the house fell ill days later, the family remembered the muttering. The story changed. Hunzi cursed us, they'd say. She hexed the child. Even dreams became part of the hunt. If someone dreamed of a woman who walked with demons, that dream could be used in court. If a man said he saw her flying in the night, it became a truth, even if no one else saw. The lines between fear, memory, and reality began to blur. And the worst part? The accused were often women who had once been respected. The healer who helped deliver children, the widow who gave soup to the sick, the neighbor who watched someone's animals while they were away. But in times of hunger, of plague, of uncertainty, fear changes how we see, and the kindest face can become the most frightening. Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, the world around her began to change. Doors no longer opened to her. Eyes followed her steps. Whispers trailed behind like a shadow she could not shake. It wasn't always the church that hunted her first. It was often her neighbors, people she had known all her life, now watching for signs, for slips, for anything strange. Did her bread rise too quickly? Did her cow give too much milk? Was her garden still green when others turned to dust? What had once been admired, thrift, skill, independence, now turned dangerous. Women who spoke their minds were at risk. A loud voice could be mistaken for pride. A sharp tongue for curses. Women who lived without men, widows, midwives, spinsters, were more vulnerable. There was no husband, no son to defend them. And so, they became easy targets. Communities began to keep records, not of crimes, but of character. He walks at night. He doesn't attend church regularly. She knows how to make butter without churning. None of these things were illegal, but they became evidence. A midwife might be called a baby stealer if a child died. An herbalist might be accused of using plants to harm, not heal. And even a woman who grieved too long after her husband's death could be said to have bewitched him. And some women tried to protect themselves. They went to church more often, gave up their practices, burned their herbs, but it rarely helped. Because once suspicion took root, it grew fast. And soon, others were pulled in. Children might be questioned, husbands pressured, friends threatened. The accused would be asked, "Who helped you? Who taught you? Whose name do you whisper when the moon is full?" Under pressure or torture, names would spill out, true or not. And then the net widened. Each name led to another. Each fear found a new face. And so the village, once whole, began to tear itself apart. By the time the church or authorities arrived, the damage was done. Trust had rotted. Friendships had crumbled. And innocence, once lost, could not be reclaimed. Because in the mind of the accuser, doubt was enough. And for the woman accused, survival was never certain. Not every woman was accused. But among those who were, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just spells or storms that drew suspicion. It was status. It was silence. It was simply being seen and then being seen too much. And across Europe, the first to fall were often the poor, the widow with cracked shoes and thin hands, the old woman who lived by the woods and traded eggs for bread, the beggar who muttered as she walked away from a closed door. If a child grew ill after such a visit, it was remembered, not with charity, but with fear. "She must have cursed us," they'd say. "She must have brought the sickness." Others were chosen not for what they did, but for what they were not. A woman without a husband was suspicious. A woman without children, even more so. And a woman who was both, dangerous. In many towns, simply living alone became a risk. Without a man to speak for her, her voice held little weight. Without children to anchor her, her purpose was questioned. Without wealth to shield her, she was easy to take. Then there were the wise women, healers, herbalists, midwives. They had helped others. They had touched bodies, caught infants, whispered comfort in the dark hours. But when fear spread, their knowledge was twisted. She knew too much. She had herbs no one else could name. She understood pain, and that meant she might have caused it. And of course, there were the outspoken, the ones who raised their voices when wronged, who refused the advances of powerful men, who said no when others expected silence. They were labeled bitter, sharp-tongued, and womanly, and in the eyes of some, that was as good as guilt. In many trials, records show how small the accusations were. He cursed when her cow died. She argued with her neighbor. She touched the wrong child's head. One woman in Essex was accused after her neighbor's pig fell sick. Another in Würzburg was tried because she offered to help a woman give birth, and the baby was stillborn. These were not crimes, but in a world turned inward with fear, they were enough. Because once a woman was seen as different, she could be seen as dangerous. And from there, the path was short, to questioning, to change, to fire. It didn't always come at night. Sometimes it was early morning, when the sun was still golden and the village barely awake. A knock on the door, a voice calling her name, and suddenly everything changed. Accusation often arrived quietly. There was no dramatic arrest, no roaring crowd, just a small group of men, sometimes local, sometimes sent by the church. They held parchment. They read names. They asked her to come with them. She was told it was a matter of questioning, that no harm would come if she simply told the truth. But truth meant nothing anymore. Truth was not what you had done, it was what they had decided. In many towns, the accused woman was taken to the village hall or a private chamber. There she would sit alone while questions began. At first they seemed simple. Do you own any unusual books? Do you speak to animals? Do you dream of flying? Her answers didn't matter much. They were recorded but rarely believed. Everything she said could be twisted. The silence could be damning, a tear a sign of guilt. If she was known to use herbs, she would be asked to name every plant she had ever touched. If she had ever quarreled, it would be brought up. If she had ever helped a woman give birth and the child died, it would be mentioned. And then came the pressure. He might be kept without food, without warmth, without rest. She might be stripped and examined for marks of the devil again, pricked with needles, prodded, watched as strangers searched her body for blemishes no one could explain. And if she resisted, hated, if she cried, screamed, pleaded, it only fed their certainty. She fights because she has something to hide. He cries because the devil is leaving her. Sometimes her family was called in. Her daughter, her husband, her sister. They would be asked, has she ever spoken strangely? Has she ever disappeared at night? And sometimes the answers were confused. A moment misremembered, a word misspoken. But once spoken, it was enough. There are records of entire villages being emptied of women, of trial lists that grew longer with each day, of children accusing mothers, of husbands breaking under pressure and naming their own wives. This was not justice. It was fear, organized and armed. A woman might spend weeks awaiting a verdict, but in many cases her fate was decided before the first question, and all the while she sat in the cold, in silence, remembering her garden, her children's laughter, the feel of wind on her face, all of it slipping away, beneath the weight of someone else's story. Once a woman was accused, once the whisper became a record, she was no longer seen as human, not a neighbor, not a mother, not a healer. She was a symbol and a danger, a lesson to others, and so the trial began. Early witch trials were local affairs, carried out in small town halls or church courts. There were no juries, only magistrates, priests, scribes, and fear. The evidence was rarely solid. No proof, no witness, just stories, or dreams, or things that everyone knew. He bewitched the cows. She looked at me with anger, and my child took sick. She was seen whispering to a black bird. And then the questions began. First gently, then with insistence. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. Tell us when you made the pact. Tell us who else was there. Sometimes the accused stayed silent. Other times they cried out. But silence and sobs meant the same thing. Confirmation. The judges would nod. The scribes would write, and the questions would continue. When words failed, torture began. In many courts, torture was considered a path to truth, a tool, a necessary discomfort to uncover sin. Some were stretched on the rack, pulled slowly until muscles tore and joints cracked. Others were pressed with heavy stones on their chests. Each added weight another question. Did you attend the Sabbath? Who flew with you? Some were hung by the wrists, bound behind their backs, their shoulders pulled from the sockets. But even if they confessed under pain, their fate was sealed. A confession meant guilt. A refusal to confess meant stubbornness, which was also guilt. The system allowed no escape. In Bamberg, Germany, hundreds were tried in a few short years. Men, women, even children. Records show the accused were often imprisoned in damp towers before trial, fed barely enough to survive, their possessions seized, their names crossed out in church books. In Scotland, confessions were often obtained with sleep deprivation. The accused were kept awake for days, sometimes weeks, while questioned again and again. Eventually, minds broke, and with them came the names of others. It was never just about the one woman. It was always about the circle. Who else was there? Whose face did you see? Every trial ended with the same question. Not if she was guilty, it was how she would be punished. And often the answer was death. But not yet. First, the crowd would gather, the trial was over, the sentence spoken. And now the road led only one way, through the town square, past the homes she once walked by in peace, to the place where smoke already lingered in the air, the execution ground. Sometimes it was a field, sometimes the churchyard, sometimes the very center of the village, where merchants had once traded grain and gossip. The woman was led there with her hands bound, sometimes barefoot, often in plain robes, never alone. A priest might walk beside her, urging her to repent. A bell might toll in slow rhythm, and behind her, the silent crowd. Some came out of pity, others from curiosity, but many came to watch, children on their fathers' shoulders, elders murmuring prayers, women hiding their faces. The accused woman was not the only one on trial. Her death served a purpose: to warn, to purify, to keep the order of the world intact. At the site, the stake stood tall, wood piled beneath it, sometimes damp to prolong the burn. Rope tied her to the post. In some places changed, and then once again she was asked to confess, to name others, to repent and save her soul. Some did, most did not, because by now they knew there was no saving to be done. The fire was not mercy. It was display, a theater of fear. In parts of France and Germany, women were burned alive. In England, they were often hanged. Then their bodies burned after. The flames rose. The crowd murmured. And the woman? Forgotten once, she was ash. No marker. Only the memory that she had been different, and that being different had been dangerous. And then life went on. Children played where the smoke had been. Markets returned. New rumors stirred, because the fear never truly ended. Once the door to accusation opened, it never shut again. Every trial created more. Every burning sowed the seeds of another. And so the fire did not just burn the body. It burned trust. It burned safety. It burned history. It taught generations that to be a woman was to be watched, that silence was safer than knowledge, that obedience was the only protection. And still, the names of the dead, those women who walked to the stake in quiet dignity, rarely survived, but their stories do, and tonight softly we remember them. The fires of persecution did not stay contained in Germany or France. They crossed borders, crept through forests, and sailed across seas. And in England, the flame took a new shape. Here the fear of witches followed its own rhythm, a mix of folk beliefs, Protestant anxiety, and social unrest. Witch trials in England began earlier than in most places. Records date back as far as the 15th century. But it wasn't until the reign of King James I that panic took hold. James had a personal obsession. He believed witches had tried to kill him during a sea voyage. He even wrote a book, Daemonology, in which he explained how to find and fight witches. It gave authority to fear, legitimacy to suspicion. And soon, England followed the same dangerous script. But the trials looked different here. Unlike in Germany, witches in England were not burned alive. They were hanged, usually on a public gallows, with crowds gathered on village greens. One of the most famous witch hunters was Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general during the English Civil War. Between 1645 and 1647, he and his associates accused over 200 people, mostly women, mostly poor, mostly alone. Hopkins traveled from town to town. He was not part of any court, not appointed by the king, but communities, desperate and confused, welcomed him. His methods were simple and cruel. He searched women's bodies for witches' marks, often stripping them in public and probing for blemishes. He practiced swimming tests, where accused women were thrown into water, tied to a rope. If they floated, they were witches. If they sank, they were innocent but often drowned. And if they confessed, their words were used to accuse others. It became a chain, a fever, the business. Hopkins was paid for every witch he found. And the more he found, the more he earned. Entire communities were consumed. Women hanged in groups. Children left behind. Villages emptied of voices that once sang lullabies. Ground grain or stitched clothing by firelight. By the time Hopkins died, young and quietly, he had left behind a trail of sorrow. England's last official witch execution happened decades later, but the fear never truly faded, because the idea had taken root that a woman's knowledge could be dangerous, that her independence was threatening, that her silence or her speech could both be used against her. The same fears that gripped Europe now had an English accent, and soon they would cross the Atlantic. Across the ocean, in the New World, a small town nestled quietly among the trees. Salem, in the colony of Massachusetts. It was a deeply religious place, hardworking, suspicious of outsiders, bound by a Puritan belief that the devil walked close, always waiting. And in the winter of 1692, something cracked. It began with two young girls, the daughter and niece of the village minister. They fell ill, twitching, shouting, claiming invisible forces pricked them with needles. Physicians could find no cause, though they blamed witchcraft. The girls began to name names, and once the naming began, it did not stop. The first accused were easy targets. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a beggar; Sarah Osborne, a sick woman who hadn't attended church in months. They were brought before the court, questioned, pressed. And when Tituba confessed, her words ignited fear like dry grass to flame. She said she had seen witches, spoken with the devil, and that others walked among them. Her confession fed the court, and the court began to feed on the town. Over the months that followed, nearly 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged, 14 of them women. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Others died in prison, awaiting trial. The accusations didn't follow logic. They followed fear. Children accused their mothers. Servants accused their masters. Neighbors turned on neighbors. A woman who baked bread for the sick was questioned. A midwife who comforted a weeping girl was accused. Even a former minister's wife found herself behind bars. The courts accepted spectral evidence, visions, dreams, feelings, as truth. And when one woman confessed under pressure, she was asked to name others. More names, more fear, more hangings. It spiraled until finally the tide turned. Prominent voices began to speak out. Doubt crept in. Even those who had once led the charge began to worry the flames might reach them too. The governor intervened. The court dissolved. The execution stopped. But the damage was done. Salem became more than a town. It became a symbol of mass hysteria, of power misused, of women condemned for simply existing in a world too afraid to understand them. And though the trials ended, the echoes remained. In the stones, in the names, in the silence of the lives never lived. The fires did not go out all at once. They flickered, they dimmed, they smoldered long after the screams had faded. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the witch hunts began to lose their grip, but not because the fear had vanished. Rather, the world was changing slowly, unevenly, and sometimes painfully. Across Europe and the American colonies, new ideas began to take root. Not all at once, not everywhere, but a change had begun. Philosophers and scientists questioned old beliefs. What had once been blamed on demons was now studied as disease. What had once been proof of witchcraft, a convulsion, a rash, a drought, was now explained with weather, biology, or chance. People began to see that many of the accused had been poor, elderly, or mentally ill, that the justice they received was not justice at all. In Germany, the great hunts faded after the horror of Bamberg and Würzburg, where dozens of women and some children had died. The sheer scale of bloodshed caused even church leaders to hesitate. In England, trials decreased after the 1,660 as the last execution for witchcraft there happened in 1685. And in 1736, the Witchcraft Act made it illegal to accuse someone of being a witch, not because witches were believed to be gone, but because the law now saw such accusations as fraud. In France and Spain, the Inquisition slowly turned away from witch trials, not because it had grown gentle, but because it feared the chaos such hunts unleashed. In Scotland, one of the most zealous countries for witch trials, the last execution took place in 1727, a woman named Janet Horne, accused by her own daughter. Even in Salem, the town that once walked in shadows, people began to speak of remorse. Some survivors were given apologies. A few received money, but nothing could return what had been taken. Still, the witch hunts did not truly vanish. They went underground. They remained in whispers. And in many places the fear remained, just quieter, harder to see, because though the flames burned lower, the ideas behind them, the fear of women's power, knowledge, and independence, still lingered. And in time, those fears would take new forms as the centuries moved forward. The flames of witch hunts dwindled to ash, but the ash remained. Dust in the corners of law books, shadows in family names lost to time, and stories passed in quiet voices. Because these hunts were never truly about spells or flying through the night. They were about control. Control over women's voices. Control over their knowledge. Control over their place in the world. For centuries, women had been trusted healers, carriers of memory, keepers of plants and prayers. But when the world became afraid, those same women were reimagined as threats. The fear of witches was a fear of women who did not stay small. Even after the trials ended, the damage endured. Midwives were pushed aside in favor of male doctors. Herbalists and folk healers were dismissed as superstitious. Women's words were viewed with suspicion. Their anger, their silence, even their kindness, all possible signs of something hidden. Generations of women grew up hearing stories, not just of witches burned, but of what could happen if they spoke out, if they stood alone, if they were too clever, too independent, too different. Is the past left a bruise on the present? And even into the 19th and 20th centuries, echoes of the witch hunts could be heard in courtrooms where women were not believed, in workplaces where they were dismissed, in homes where their strength was called unnatural. And still, in parts of the world today, women are accused of witchcraft, beaten, driven from their homes, killed, not because of potions, but because they were widows, because they refused to marry, because a child fell sick and someone had to be blamed. The witch hunts may belong to the past in Europe and America, but their shape remains. In every place where fear becomes violence, where power hides behind righteousness, and where silence is mistaken for peace. Tonight, as we close this chapter, we remember not just the women who died, but the world they lived in, a world that taught them to be afraid of their own voice, in their own mind, their own strength. And as we drift into rest, we carry their memory like a quiet lantern, a soft flicker in the dark, saying, "You were not alone." Not every accused woman burned. Some survived, but survival came with a price. In many cases, the only way to live was to confess, to say yes, to say you danced with the devil, to say you brewed poisons or whispered curses, even if it was all a lie, because the courts didn't want truth. They wanted agreement. A woman who confessed might avoid the fire, but only if she also gave names. Who else was there? Who led the Sabbath? Who flew with you? The names poured out, not because they were real, but because it was the only way to stop the pain. And so, survival turned women into weapons. Their words, forced under torture, became the trap for others. This was the cruelty of the witch hunts. To save yourself, you had to sacrifice your neighbor, or your sister, or your friend. Records show women naming each other in strings, not out of malice, but out of desperation. Because when your ribs are cracked and your body broken, even a lie can feel like a door to freedom. But it wasn't freedom, not truly. Women who confessed were often shunned. Even after their release, they lived on the edge of the village. Whispers followed them. Their children were marked. They were no longer burned, but they were no longer seen. In Scotland, some confessed and were kept under house arrest for years. In Germany, others were forced to pay the cost of their own trial. Chains, guards, court scribes. Many returned home penniless, alone, and watched the world carry on without them. Even when execution was avoided, the accusation never disappeared. A single finger, pointed once, could follow a woman to her grave, and for some, even confession was not enough. They were promised mercy, then hanged anyway. The witch hunts were not just death. They were humiliation. They were exile. They were the quiet destruction of a life from the inside out. And those who lived often asked, was it truly better than burning? For the few who lived, the silence afterward could be just as heavy as the fire. A woman returned from trial not to celebration, but to suspicion, whispers, and doors left quietly closed. She might come home to find her garden untended, her animals gone, her name never spoken at the village well. If she had children, they bore the same shadow. Witch's daughter, witch's son, treated with caution, as though guilt could be inherited like eye color or a crooked smile. Many survivors left. They walked away from villages they'd known since birth, seeking some place where no one knew their name. Some became wanderers, some disappeared into the woods. A few took to new cities and lived in quiet corners, and some stayed, not because they were welcomed, but because they had nowhere else to go. They became watchers, moving in silence, avoiding the market, the church, the festivals, but among themselves, they remembered. In secret, some of them formed bonds with others like them, old women and outcasts, widows and healers. They gathered at dusk to share food, to speak freely. Sometimes they sang, sometimes they simply sat in peace. A defiance softer than rebellion, but stronger than fear. The strength it took to survive such trials didn't come from magic. It came from endurance, the ability to keep walking after being broken, to keep speaking after being silenced, to hold your head high while the world looked away. Historians have found fragments of these lives. Letters never sent, prayers scribbled in margins, herbal recipes passed between generations. They reveal not just sorrow, but resilience. Because though the world tried to erase these women, they left traces, in stories, in soil, in memory. And tonight, as you rest, know that the ones who survived did not vanish. They lived on in their daughters, in the herbs they planted, in the quiet strength of those who refused to be forgotten. Witch hunts did not begin with fire. They began with fear, fear of the unknown, fear of illness, fear of failure, fear of women. At their core, these persecutions were not truly about magic. They were about blame. When crops failed, someone had to answer. When a child died, someone had to be punished. When storms wrecked a village or cattle wasted away, the world looked for a face to attach to its pain, and it chose women, especially those who lived alone, those who healed without permission, those who did not follow the script. In truth, many of the accused had traits that made them stand out. They were independent, clever, or outspoken. Sometimes they were simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong expression. The machinery of the trials was built on three powerful forces: religious fear, the belief that the devil walked the earth, that he whispered to women in the dark, that salvation required rooting out evil in flesh and bone. Social tension, poverty, war, disease, famine. In such times, communities became brittle. Suspicion was easier than compassion. A scapegoat soothed the chaos. Legal structure, laws that rewarded confession, courts that accepted dreams as evidence, and officials eager to demonstrate righteousness. These forces fed one another. One fear led to another, accusation. One execution made the next easier. And beneath it all, a deeply held belief that women were weaker, more emotional, easily tempted. It was not just superstition. It was misogyny, shaped by law and blessed by religion. Witch hunts gave communities a strange kind of order. They created enemies from within, so that those in power could feel safe. But that safety was an illusion. No one was truly protected, not even the accusers. Because when fear governs, it does not ask who is guilty, only who's next. And so the question remains, how could so many believe? The answer lies not in ignorance, but in desperation. Witch hunts offered meaning in a world that often made no sense. They turned grief into action, confusion into judgment. And though the fire has faded, that human hunger for certainty, for someone to blame, remains. Centuries passed, the fires died, the laws were repealed, but the word remained. Once a sentence, now a symbol. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a quiet movement began. Artists, writers, historians, healers. They looked back on the women who had been accused not as villains, but as victims, and more than that, as symbols of resistance. The word witch, once soaked in fear, began to be spoken differently, with curiosity, with defiance, with pride. Feminist thinkers saw in the burned and broken women of the past a reflection of how the world treated women still. They asked, why were women punished for speaking out, for healing, for living alone? Why were they silenced for having wisdom, or for simply existing outside the mold? And slowly, the figure of the witch became something new. Not evil, unwise, not cursed, but powerful. Books were written, songs were sung, statues were raised, and in classrooms and kitchens, the stories were told again, but this time with dignity. In parts of the world, the word witch was reclaimed. It came to stand for independence, for rebellion, for a woman who would not be defined by anyone else. In modern art and culture, witches began to appear not as villains, but as complex figures, sometimes dark, sometimes gentle, but always strong. Even in spiritual movements like Wicca or neo-paganism, the term witch was embraced by some as a connection to earth, healing, and ancient traditions, not to darkness, but to balance. Today, many still misunderstand, many still fear, but every time the story is told of the women who were once hunted, hanged, burned, and forgotten, a part of them returns, not in smoke, not in whispers, but in memory. They do not ask for pity, only for truth, and for the space to say, I lived, it mattered, I will not be erased. Though centuries have passed since the last flames died, the witch hunt never truly ended. It simply changed shape. Today, the word witch may not be spoken in courtrooms, but the same forces remain. Fear, control, and the punishment of women who speak too loudly or shine too brightly. We see it in headlines and whispers, in the way powerful women are mocked, doubted, or torn down. She's too ambitious. She's too loud. She must have used tricks. She must be dangerous. The tools may no longer be fire and rope, but shame and ridicule still burn. In politics, a woman in power is often judged not by her work, but by her voice, her clothes, her expression. If she shows emotion, she is hysterical. She does not, she is cold. In the workplace, a woman who leads is often asked to soften, to smile more, to be less assertive. In media and entertainment, strong women are called unnatural, intimidating, or threatening. And around the world, in some regions, accusations of witchcraft still claim lives. In parts of Africa, South Asia, and South America, women are still attacked, exiled, even killed for being different, for surviving illness, for living alone. Even today, the spark of ancient fear finds new kindling, and yet there is resistance. More people are speaking out, books are being written, memorials are being built, and the silence that once swallowed these women is being filled with their names. Educators teach the truth of the witch hunts. Historians preserve the stories. Artists create new images, not of women in flames, but of women rising. And for every woman silenced, 1,000 more have found their voice. The witch hunt is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning, a reminder of what fear can do when it wears the mask of justice. But it is also a promise that history once hidden can be reclaimed, that dignity once stripped away can be restored, that even in the quiet of night, when we remember those who were lost, and we carry them forward, not as symbols of sorrow, but as beacons of truth. Thousands of women vanished into history without even a name. No grave, no headstone, no record but a dusty court scroll, a mark beside a charge, a note of execution, and then silence. We often remember the famous cases, the Salem trials, the Würzburg flames, the writings of judges and kings, but behind them, there were thousands of quiet lives, mothers, midwives, herbalists, widows, healers. Their names were spoken only in panic, scribbled in ink on damp parchment, then struck from memory, and yet they lived. They woke before dawn to draw water. They made soup for the sick. They taught their children to sing. They walked through fields and forests, knowing the sky and the soil better than most priests. They laughed. They wept. They were human, and their only crime was being seen at the wrong time, by the wrong eyes. Maybe they lived too long. Maybe they smiled too little. Maybe they gave advice that worked too well. And then Someone whispered, and the town turned. Those stories are not in books, but they are in the silence between them, in the space where questions sit, where grief lingers. Historians today try to gather fragments, a baptism record, a scribbled inventory of a home seized after death, a note about a child left behind. Sometimes that's all there is, but from those fragments, we know this: they were not monsters. They were not witches. They were women, ordinary, fragile, strong. They lived in a world that turned against them. And though it tried to erase them, it failed, because tonight you remember, and remembering is a quiet act of justice. History is not always behind us. Sometimes it follows, soft-footed, quiet, waiting to be seen again. The witch hunts are over, the stakes are gone, but the patterns remain. We still fear what we don't understand. We still blame those who are different. And too often, we still question the woman who speaks, when others would rather she stay silent. The women who were hunted were not dangerous. They were vulnerable, but the idea of their power, of their independence, was enough to terrify the world around them. That fear turned into laws, into torture, into execution. So what can we learn? We learn that fear is not neutral. It chooses its victims. It shapes itself into rules. It pretends to be safety. We learn that justice must be more than punishment. It must be built on empathy, on listening, on refusing to look away. And we learn that remembering matters, because silence lets the past repeat. But memory, gentle, honest memory, turns pain into purpose. Across Europe now, there are memorials rising in Germany, in Switzerland, in Scotland, stone walls with names carved, plaques beside churches, public apologies from governments long removed from the crimes. People gather, they light candles, they read names aloud. Some hold ceremonies not to reopen old wounds, but to say, "We see you now. We failed you then. You mattered." This is not just history. It is a mirror, because the line between justice and fear is still thin. And the work of compassion, of truth, of seeing every human being as fully human, is never finished. So tonight, as you let your eyes close, know that your act of listening is part of that work. The witch hunts were a tragedy, but remembering them with care is a quiet form of resistance. It says, not again, not this way, not ever. There is a thread that runs through time. It begins in the quiet hands of a woman grinding herbs, carrying bread, whispering songs to children. It winds through the dark cells of a prison, across the cold floor of a courtroom, beneath the ash of a burned field. It is not a thread of magic, though some might call it that. It is the thread of endurance. From village to village, from century to century, women have carried this thread, through silence, through fire, through forgetting. And in the end, it is this thread that survived. Not the flames, not the lies, not the names scribbled in court ledgers or shouted in fury, but the thread of care, of memory, of strength passed from hand to hand. Sometimes the women accused of witchcraft were healers. Sometimes they were widows. Sometimes they were just unlucky. But all of them stood at the edge of something, between the known and the feared, the accepted and the condemned. And while the world saw danger, what they held was something else, a kind of truth, the truth that the world can be cruel, but still, one can live with dignity. That power need not come from spellbooks, but from survival, from tenderness, from the quiet courage to keep going. The fire tried to destroy that truth, but it couldn't, because fire cannot burn what has no shape. Memory, meaning the whisper of one woman's story into another's ear. Now, in our time, That thread has become a tapestry. Books, poems, songs, paintings and films and voices rising. It's one said, she was here, she lived, she mattered. And so tonight, as you drift into rest, know that the thread has reached you too. You carry it now, in your listening, in your remembering, in your willingness to see the women who were once made invisible. Let it warm you, let it settle into silence. Let it remind you that even in the darkest chapters, there is always a light, small, steady, and waiting to be passed on. If you travel to certain corners of Europe, you may walk where they once stood. A quiet field in Lancashire, a forest path in Bavaria, a windswept cliffside in Scotland. There are no screams now, only birdsong and the rustle of leaves. But the earth remembers. In Salem, Massachusetts, you can walk through museums and gardens, past names etched into stone. In Norway, plaques sit in town squares. Where women were once dragged from their homes, in Switzerland, hills that once held the gallows now carry sheep and wildflowers. It is not the fire that lingers, but the stillness. And in that stillness, a weight remains. In some places, the local people have reclaimed these spaces. They have placed benches, planted roses, hung signs that say, "We remember." But in many others, these sites are forgotten. A tourist passes a ruined wall, not knowing that beneath it lies a story once soaked in sorrow. And so a quiet movement has grown, one that seeks not revenge, but remembrance. Witch trial memorials now rise in towns once filled with fear. Simple stones, engraved names, circles of candles. Nothing elaborate, just a way to say, you lived. He was not what they said. School children visit these places now. They read old transcripts, they light small lanterns, and for a moment, those long silenced voices are heard again. It is healing work, gentle work, but vital. Because history isn't just written in books. It is written in land, in architecture, in the spaces between stones. And where women once walked in fear, others now walk in peace. This, too, is justice. The quiet kind, the lasting kind. A bench, a name, a whisper carried by the wind. Some names we know, some stories we've recovered, but most we never will. The women accused of witchcraft were often poor, illiterate, forgotten by history even before they died. Their names were not carved into monuments, their lives not written in letters or journals. They passed like shadows, and yet they were real. They had favorite songs, favorite herbs for healing, memories of a mother's voice, or the smell of bread in a childhood kitchen. They had moments of joy and days of fear. And though their lives were taken by fear and fire, they were never truly erased. Because even without records, we feel their presence in every story told, and every injustice recognized, in every woman who chooses to stand tall today, because others once could not. So tonight, we light a candle for the unnamed, for the young girl accused for no reason, for the midwife who saved lives but was feared, for the lonely widow made into a scapegoat, for the mother who never came home. We do not know your names, but we carry your legacy. You are real. You mattered. And as long as stories are told, you will not vanish. Even now, in the dark hush before sleep, you are remembered. The candle glows. The wind is quiet, and memory settles like a soft blanket across the world. Not all wounds heal, but remembering can be a balm. And in that remembrance, gentle, steady, we find not just sorrow, really hope. Good evening, friends. If your eyes are heavy now, and the world has grown soft around the edges, You've made it to the end of a long, difficult journey tonight. We walked beside women history tried to forget. We stood in shadowy cellars, in cold courtrooms, beside roaring fires that should never have been lit. We listened not to the voices of kings or inquisitors, but to those silenced, those whose stories were buried, whose names were lost in ash and ink. They were not witches. They were not devils. And they were simply women. Women who lived too boldly, loved too freely, spoke too sharply, or sometimes did nothing at all. History teaches us many things, but above all, it teaches us that cruelty often wears the robes of righteousness. What happened to these women was not fate, it was choice. By churches, by kings, by neighbors. It was fear, systematized, legalized, and ritualized. And it was deeply, tragically human. Yet, in remembering them tonight, we've done something powerful. We've reversed the silence. We've looked backward, not with judgment, but with compassion. We've taken time to say, you existed, you are real, and you will not be erased. Even if their names were never written, even if their voices were never heard, they are part of us now, a part of the long human thread, woven with sorrow and strength, fire and survival. And what of us? What will we do with this memory? Maybe we listen more carefully. Maybe we speak more gently. Maybe we question power when it demands silence. Maybe we remember that justice without kindness is just another kind of fire. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your body relaxes into the safety of stillness, know this: the women you've met in this story, they are not gone, they are with us, in our kasha, our courage, and our care for those still vulnerable. They walk beside us. Whenever we choose truth over fear, dignity over shame, and remembrance over forgetting, let their memory settle like falling ash, soft, weightless, but never gone. Thank you for walking this path. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering. Now rest. The fire is out. The voices are quiet. And peace at last has returned. Good night.